My name is Michael Carter, and for most of my 40 years, I've prided myself on being a man who pays attention to the details. Maybe it's my job as a project manager, or maybe it's just part of my nature. Either way, I've always believed that little things matter, which is why it surprised me to realize how blind I'd been to the changes in my wife, Emily. Emily and I had been married for 12 years. She was a writer, talented, passionate, and endlessly creative. Over the years, I'd watched her pour her soul into her work, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she brought her stories to life. It was one of the things I admired most about her. But lately, her writing had taken on a different tone, something secretive, almost guarded. It started a few months ago when she began disappearing for hours at a time. At first, she told me she was attending writing workshops or researching for her next book. I didn't think much of it. Writing was her passion, and I'd always encouraged her to pursue it. But as the weeks went by, her absences became more frequent, her excuses more vague. "Where were you today?" I asked one evening as she walked through the door, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly mussed. "Oh, just at the library," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I lost track of time." I nodded, but something about her answer felt rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for the question. Still, I didn't press her. Emily wasn't the type to hide things from me, or so I thought. Then one evening, while she was out writing, I stumbled across something that made my heart skip a beat. I was cleaning up her office, a small, cozy room filled with books and papers, when I noticed a folder on her desk labeled Drafts. Curious, I opened it and found a stack of printed pages. The title at the top read, "The Hidden Flame." Intrigued, I sat down and began to read. The story was about a woman named Evelyn, a writer who felt trapped in her marriage and found solace in the arms of a mysterious man named Nathan. The writing was beautiful, evocative, and painfully raw. But what struck me most was how familiar it all felt. Evelyn's husband, Mark, was described as steady, reliable, but emotionally distant. Nathan, on the other hand, was wild, passionate, and free-spirited. The scenes between Evelyn and Nathan were charged with emotion, their stolen moments described in vivid, intimate detail. As I read, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. The parallels between Evelyn and Emily were impossible to ignore. The way Evelyn described her husband's habits, his quirks, they were mine. And Nathan? His physical description matched someone Emily had mentioned in passing, a man named Aaron from her old writing group. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was just a fictional story. But the more I read, the harder it was to shake the feeling that these weren't just characters. This was our life, our marriage, filtered through Emily's perspective. And Nathan wasn't just a figment of her imagination. When Emily came home that night, I couldn't look at her the same way. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips warm and familiar, but I felt a chasm between us. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I didn't know how to start. If I was wrong, if this was just a story, I could destroy the trust we'd built over the years. But if I was right, I spent the next few days watching her more closely, looking for signs I might have missed before. She seemed happy, relaxed even, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. When I asked about her writing, she was vague, saying only that it was coming along. I couldn't stop thinking about the story, about the moments between Evelyn and Nathan that felt too real to be fiction. I started noticing small details, how Emily always seemed to smile when her phone buzzed, how she'd excuse herself to take calls in the other room. I even noticed a new perfume on her that I hadn't smelled before, subtle but unmistakable. Then one evening, as she worked on her laptop in the living room, I caught a glimpse of her screen. She was typing furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. The title of the document at the top of the page sent a chill down my spine. The Hidden Flame, Chapter 8. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. But how do you confront someone you love without tearing everything apart? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. The discovery of the hidden flame consumed me. Every word, every scene lingered in my mind, twisting my perception of Emily and our marriage. I couldn't shake the parallels between her fictional characters and our real lives. Nor could I ignore the nagging feeling that her story wasn't just a work of imagination. I began to piece together fragments of the past few months, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt glaring. The way she'd become increasingly protective of her laptop, the nights she claimed she needed quiet to focus on her writing, and the sudden influx of solo outings under the guise of creative inspiration. It all pointed to something, or someone, I didn't want to believe existed. That weekend, Emily told me she was going to a nearby cafe to work on her novel. "It's too distracting at home," she said with a sheepish smile, holding up her laptop bag. "I just need a change of scenery." "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "Do you want me to drop you off?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it's fine. I'll drive myself." Her answer only fueled my suspicions, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I waited until she left, watching from the window as her car disappeared down the street. My hands trembled as I grabbed my keys and followed her, keeping a safe distance. She didn't go to the cafe. Instead, she drove across town to a quiet park I didn't recognize. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she got out of the car, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder. My stomach twisted when I saw a man approach her, tall with dark hair and a casual confidence that immediately reminded me of Nathan from her story. They exchanged a warm smile, and then she hugged him. Not a casual, friendly hug, but the kind that lingered too long. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as I watched them walk together toward a secluded bench beneath a large oak tree. Emily opened her laptop, and they leaned in close, their heads nearly touching as they talked. It looked innocent enough from a distance, but I knew better. This wasn't a writing session. This was the real-life inspiration for her fiction. I sat there for what felt like hours, torn between confronting her on the spot and driving away. My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to ask, let alone hear the answers to. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And most painfully, what did he have that I didn't? When Emily finally left, she didn't look guilty or nervous. She looked happy, as if nothing in her world was out of place. I followed her home, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion. She parked in the driveway and walked inside, her laptop bag slung casually over her shoulder. That evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I couldn't bring myself to eat. She chatted about her day, her voice light and cheerful, but I barely heard her. All I could think about was the man in the park and the way her face lit up when she was with him. "Everything okay?" she asked, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a long day at work." She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and went back to eating. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman sitting in front of me with the one I'd seen earlier. How could she lie so easily? How could she look me in the eye and act as if nothing was wrong? That night, while she slept, I made my decision. I couldn't keep living in the shadows of her lies. If I wanted the truth, I would have to find it myself. The next morning, I waited until Emily left for another writing session before heading to her office. My heart pounded as I opened her laptop, praying she hadn't set up a password. To my relief, the screen unlocked, revealing her desktop. I clicked on her recent documents, and there it was, the hidden flame. I opened the file, scrolling through the pages with trembling hands. The story had progressed since the last draft I'd read, and the details were even more damning. Evelyn and Nathan's affair had deepened, their stolen moments described with such vividness that I could almost see them happening, and then I read a passage that made my blood run cold. They met beneath the great oak in the park, their sanctuary hidden from the world. Evelyn's heart raced as Nathan's hand brushed hers, his touch igniting a fire she hadn't felt in years. "This feels wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But it doesn't." The oak tree, the park, it was all there, laid out in black and white. This wasn't just a story, it was a confession. When Emily came home that evening, I was waiting for her in the living room. She smiled when she saw me, but her expression faltered when she noticed the printed pages of her manuscript on the coffee table. "Michael," she said cautiously, her voice trembling, "what's this?" I stood, my heart pounding as I held her gaze. "I think you know." Emily froze, her eyes darting between the printed pages on the coffee table and the anger simmering in my expression. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in years, the ever-confident, eloquent writer seemed completely lost for what to say. "You've been writing some interesting stories," I said, my voice calm but laced with bitterness. "Care to explain?" Her hands trembled as she reached for the pages, her fingers brushing the paper like it might burn her. "Michael, don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about. I read it, Emily, all of it." Her face crumpled, and she sank into the armchair across from me, clutching the pages to her chest. "It's just a story," she whispered. "Fiction?" "Fiction?" I leaned forward, my voice rising. "Meeting under an oak tree in the park? A man named Nathan who sounds suspiciously like Aaron from your writing group." "Come on, Emily, don't lie to me." Her lips parted, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as tears began to fall. For a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt, but it was quickly swallowed by the weight of her betrayal. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. "How long has this been going on?" She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face a mixture of guilt and desperation. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice cracking. "I haven't. Nothing physical has happened, Michael." I swear I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Nothing physical? And I'm supposed to believe that? After everything I've read, after seeing you with him in the park?" Her eyes widened and she gasped. "You followed me." "Yes, I followed you," I said, my anger finally spilling over. What else was I supposed to do when my wife spends hours away, lying about where she's going, and then writes thinly veiled confessions disguised as fiction? She flinched, her tears falling harder now. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice sharp. "You didn't just hurt me, Emily. You broke us. Every time you left, every lie you told, every word you wrote, it's like you were ripping apart everything we built together." She reached out toward me, but I stepped back, the distance between us feeling insurmountable. "Michael, please," she begged. "Let me explain." "Then explain," I said, folding my arms. "Tell me why. Why him? Why this?" She took a shaky breath, clutching the pages in her lap as if they were her lifeline. "I didn't go looking for it," she began. "Aaron and I reconnected at that writing group, and at first it was just about the work. We talked about our stories, our struggles as writers. He understood things about me that I hadn't even admitted to myself." "And I didn't?" I asked bitterly. She shook her head quickly. "It wasn't about you, Michael. It was about me. I felt stuck, like I wasn't allowed to feel passion or excitement anymore. Writing about Evelyn and Nathan, it was a way to explore those feelings without acting on them. I thought it was harmless." "Harmless?" I said, my voice rising again. "Do you even hear yourself? You built an entire fantasy world around your feelings for another man, and you didn't think that would hurt me?" Her tears fell faster, and she looked down at the pages in her hands. "I never meant for it to become real," she said softly, "but somewhere along the way, I lost control. I let myself believe that what I was feeling wasn't wrong, because it was only in my head. But then what?" I pressed. She hesitated, her face crumpling as she whispered, "Then it wasn't just in my head anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sank back into the couch, the air knocked out of me. "So you're admitting it," I said hoarsely. "You're admitting there's something between you." She nodded slowly, her face a mask of shame. "But I swear, Michael, it hasn't gone further than that. I haven't—" She choked on the words. "I haven't crossed that line." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "And what am I supposed to do with that, Emily? Pat you on the back for your restraint? Pretend it doesn't matter because you haven't crossed the line yet?" Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands again. "I don't know what to say," she cried. "I don't know how to fix this." The truth was, neither did I. The betrayal cut too deep. The trust between us shattered. I wanted to scream, to cry, to walk out the door and never look back. But part of me still loved her, and that part held me in place. "I need time," I said finally, my voice hollow. "I need space to figure out what comes next." She nodded, her tears falling silently as I stood and walked toward the door. As I reached for my coat, she called out softly, "Michael?" I turned, my hand on the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never stopped loving you." I closed my eyes, her words ringing hollow in my ears. Without responding, I stepped out into the cool night air, unsure if I would ever be able to forgive her or if I even wanted to. The days following my confrontation with Emily were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. I stayed with a friend, Ben, who offered me his spare room without asking too many questions. Ben and I had known each other for years, and while I appreciated his support, I wasn't ready to unpack everything I was feeling. The betrayal, the anger, the overwhelming sadness. It all swirled inside me, too raw to put into words. Emily texted me every day. At first, her messages were long, filled with apologies and promises to make things right. When I didn't respond, they grew shorter, more desperate. "Please come home. We need to talk." "I love you, Michael. I'll do anything to fix this. I'm begging you. Just tell me you're okay." I read each message with a mix of longing and resentment. Part of me wanted to reply, to hear her voice and let her explain herself further. But another part of me, the part that felt broken beyond repair, couldn't bring itself to engage. I needed time, space to process what had happened, and she needed to understand that. Ben gave me my space, though he checked in occasionally. One evening, after a week of silence, he found me sitting on the balcony with a beer in hand, staring at the city lights. "You've been quiet," he said, pulling up a chair beside me. "Want to talk about it?" I took a long sip of my beer, debating how much to share. Finally, I said, "Emily's been seeing someone, emotionally at least." She used her writing as an excuse to meet him. Ben frowned, his brow furrowing. "That's rough, man. I'm sorry." "It's not just that," I continued, my voice hollow. "She wrote about it, turned her affair into a story. Reading it felt like watching our marriage fall apart in slow motion." He shook his head, letting out a low whistle. "That's something else. Do you think it's over between you two?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to try, but I don't know if I can ever trust her again." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Trust isn't something you can just snap back into place. It's earned, little by little. But you have to decide if she's worth that effort." His words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Was Emily worth the effort? Could I see a future where I forgave her, where we rebuilt what we lost? The answers didn't come easily, but I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. After another week, I decided it was time to confront the situation head-on. I texted Emily, letting her know I was ready to talk. Her response came almost immediately. "Thank you. I'll be here whenever you're ready." I arrived at the house in the late afternoon, my heart pounding as I stepped through the front door. Emily was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her usual energy replaced by a quiet sadness. "Michael," she said softly, rising from the couch. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. She gestured for me to sit, and I did, keeping a careful distance between us. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence stretching unbearably. "I don't know where to start," she said finally, her voice trembling, "but I want you to know that I'm so sorry. For everything. For lying to you. For hurting you. I know I can't take it back, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me." Her words were earnest, but they didn't make the pain disappear. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice raw. "What was so wrong with us that you felt the need to look somewhere else?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "It wasn't about us," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken before. "It was about me. I felt lost, like I didn't know who I was anymore. Writing about Evelyn and Nathan, it was my way of trying to understand those feelings. And Aaron, he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But I never stopped loving you, Michael. Not for a second." Her confession cut deep, but it also gave me clarity. She wasn't trying to justify her actions or shift the blame. She was being honest, laying bare the emotions that had driven her choices. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me see her humanity, the flawed, vulnerable person behind the betrayal. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter. She hesitated, wiping her tears. "That's up to you. I want to fix this. to earn your trust again. But I know it won't be easy, and I know it might not even be possible. All I can do is tell you the truth and hope you'll give me a chance." I leaned back, running a hand through my hair as I processed her words. The anger and hurt were still there, but beneath them, I felt a flicker of something else, the love we'd shared for so many years. It wasn't gone. It had just been buried under the weight of everything we'd been through. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to try. If you're serious about fixing this, then we'll take it one day at a time." Her eyes filled with hope, and she nodded fervently. "I am, Michael. I'll do whatever it takes." The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could find a way back to each other if we were willing to fight for it. The days that followed my decision to try and rebuild with Emily were both challenging and strangely cathartic. For the first time in a long time, we were forced to confront each other, not as the couple we used to be, but as two individuals trying to mend what had been broken. It was raw, uncomfortable, and deeply emotional, but it was also necessary. We started with counseling. Emily found a therapist who specialized in relationships, someone who could help us navigate the mess we had created. Our first session was tense. I sat stiffly on one side of the room, Emily on the other, both of us unsure how to begin. The therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Meyer, broke the silence. "Why don't we start with why you're here?" she asked gently. "Michael, would you like to begin?" I took a deep breath, my chest tightening as I searched for the right words. "I'm here because I want to understand," I said finally. "I want to understand why she lied to me, why she felt the need to find whatever it was she thought she was missing." Emily flinched but nodded. "I'm here because I want to make things right," she said softly. "I know I hurt Michael in ways I can't undo, but I love him, and I want to rebuild our marriage. I'll do whatever it takes to earn his trust again." Dr. Meyer nodded, her calm demeanor putting us both at ease. "Rebuilding trust is a process," she said. "It's not about forgetting what happened, but about learning how to move forward together. Are you both committed to that?" I glanced at Emily. Her eyes were filled with hope and determination, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Belief. Belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I'm willing to try." Emily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "So am I." The sessions forced us to face truths we'd been avoiding for years. Emily opened up about her feelings of stagnation, about how she'd poured so much of herself into her writing that she'd started to lose touch with who she was outside of her stories. I admitted that I'd taken our relationship for granted, assuming that as long as I provided stability, everything else would fall into place. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the pain felt too great to bear, when the anger and resentment threatened to tear us apart all over again. But with time, those moments became fewer and farther between. Emily made good on her promise to be transparent. She deleted Aaron's contact information, cut ties with the writing group, and set firm boundaries for her creative work. She even shared her drafts with me, inviting me into the process in a way she never had before. At first, reading her writing was difficult. Every word felt like a reminder of her betrayal, a glimpse into the emotions that had driven her choices. But as time went on, I began to see it differently. Her stories became a window into her mind, a way for us to reconnect and understand each other in ways we hadn't before. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Emily handed me a new draft she'd been working on. "It's different this time," she said, her voice tentative. "I wanted to write something honest, something about us." I took the pages, my chest tightening as I glanced at the title, Rekindled. As I read, I felt a mix of emotions, pain, hope, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The story was about a couple on the brink of collapse, their lives fractured by secrets and mistakes. But it wasn't just a tale of betrayal, it was a story of redemption, of two people choosing to fight for each other despite the odds. When I finished, I looked up at her, tears in my eyes. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And it's us." She smiled, her own tears falling freely. "That's all I want, Michael, to find us again." The road to healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the weight of the past threatened to pull us under. But we kept going, one step at a time, building a new foundation from the pieces of what we lost. Months later, as we celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come. The trust between us was still fragile, but it was growing stronger every day. And while our marriage would never be the same as it was before, I realized that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. We weren't the same people we'd been when we said our vows all those years ago. We were older, more flawed, and a little more broken, but we were also wiser, more honest, and more willing to fight for each other than we'd ever been. As Emily raised her glass to toast, her eyes shining with love and determination, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for the future, for the life we were rebuilding, and for the new chapter we were writing together. When Emily and I first met, it was one of those moments that seemed ripped straight from a romantic comedy. I was sitting in a crowded cafe, juggling a laptop, a cup of black coffee, and a stack of project reports that were overdue. Emily walked in, her presence like a sudden shift in the air. She wasn't the most conventionally beautiful woman in the room, but there was something magnetic about her. The way she carried herself, the way her auburn hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, the faint smudge of ink on her wrist that hinted at a creative soul. Our eyes met as she ordered her drink, and I offered a polite smile before turning back to my laptop. Moments later, she sat down at the table next to mine, pulling out a notebook and pen. I glanced over, intrigued by the rapid scribbling on the page and the occasional furrow of her brow. She was engrossed, lost in a world of her own making. "Writer?" I asked, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled, but quickly recovered with a shy smile. "Trying to be." That was how it started. A simple question, a shared laugh, and an unplanned conversation about books, creativity, and the peculiar charm of that little cafe. We exchanged numbers before we left, and within weeks we were inseparable. Emily's passion for writing drew me in. She wasn't just a storyteller. She was a dreamer, someone who saw the world in shades of emotion and possibility. I loved that about her. Our relationship was a whirlwind, and within 2 years we were married. Life wasn't perfect. We had our share of arguments and misunderstandings, but we always found our way back to each other. Emily's career as a writer began to take off slowly, with her short stories published in small magazines and online journals. I was her biggest cheerleader, reading every draft, attending every launch, and encouraging her when rejection letters piled up. But as the years passed, life began to shift. I got a promotion at work that demanded longer hours, and Emily threw herself deeper into her writing, determined to finish her first novel. We still made time for each other, movie nights on the couch, quiet dinners at home. But there was a subtle change in the air. Conversations became shorter, our laughter less frequent. We didn't notice it happening, not at first, but the gap between us grew a little wider each day. Emily's writing habits became more erratic. She would wake up in the middle of the night to jot down ideas or disappear into her office for hours without explanation. When I asked her about it, she would shrug and say, "Inspiration doesn't wait, you know." I admired her dedication, but I couldn't help feeling like an outsider in her world. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find her sitting at the dining table, her laptop open and her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "Hey," I said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Hey," she murmured absently, her fingers still tapping at the keys. "What are you working on?" "A new story," she said, her tone distracted. "What's it about?" She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'm not ready to talk about it yet," she said finally, offering me a small smile. "But I think it might be my best one yet." I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. I wanted to be supportive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was keeping something from me. It wasn't just her reluctance to share her work. It was the way she had started to pull away in other areas too. Little things like the way she avoided eye contact when I asked about her day, or how she had started going out more often, claiming she needed a change of scenery to write. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Writers were notoriously eccentric, and Emily had always been more intense when she was deep into a project. But as the weeks turned into months, the cracks in our relationship became harder to ignore. One night as we lay in bed, I turned to her and asked, "Are you happy, Em?" She looked at me, her eyes shadowed in the dim light. "Of course I am," she said, but there was something in her voice, hesitation maybe, that made my chest tighten. "Are you sure?" She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm just tired, Michael. Writing takes a lot out of me." I nodded, letting it drop, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I started paying closer attention, noticing things I hadn't before. The way she always seemed to smile when her phone buzzed, how she would turn the screen away when I entered the room. The nights she claimed she was going to writing workshops but came home smelling faintly of perfume I didn't recognize. Still, I didn't press her. I wanted to believe her, to trust her. I wanted to think that whatever was happening, it was just a phase, a bump in the road. After all, every couple went through rough patches, didn't they? But deep down, I knew something had changed. Emily wasn't the same woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Or maybe I wasn't the same man. Either way, the distance between us felt insurmountable, like we were standing on opposite sides of a canyon with no way to bridge the gap. And then, one quiet evening, I found the hidden flame. It was almost an accident. Emily had gone out, leaving her laptop open on the desk. I wasn't snooping. I had walked into her office to grab a pen and saw the file minimized on the screen. The title caught my eye, and before I could stop myself, I clicked on it. The words on the page were beautiful, haunting, and painfully familiar. They weren't just a story. They were a mirror reflecting back all the fears and insecurities I hadn't dared to name. As I read, my hands began to shake, my chest tightening with every word. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was there, spelled out in black and white. This wasn't fiction. This was my life, our marriage, reimagined through Emily's eyes. And at the center of it all was a man I didn't know. A man who had somehow become the spark in her story, the shadow in mine. When Emily came home that night, I knew everything had changed. And for the first time, I wasn't sure we could find our way back to each other.